In the summer of 1905, in what is now Tanzania, tens of thousands of African warriors charged into German machine gun fire. They believed they were invincible. They believed that the sacred water they drunk, Maji in Swahili, would turn the colonizers' bullets into harmless drops of water. They were wrong. What followed was one of the deadliest colonial wars in African history, a war that's been deliberately forgotten, a war where the weapons weren't just guns and bullets, but starvation, scorched earth, and the systematic destruction of entire societies. By the time the smoke cleared, in 1907, between 250,000 and 300,000 people were dead, roughly one-third of the entire population of southern German East Africa. The Maji Maji Rebellion wasn't just another colonial uprising. It was a Holocaust, and almost nobody talks about it. I'm your host, and over the next 3 hours, we're going to uncover one of history's darkest chapters. We'll explore how belief became rebellion, how resistance became massacre, and how the German Empire used famine as a weapon of mass destruction. This is a story about colonialism at its most brutal, about faith in the face of overwhelming force, and about a genocide that Germany has never fully reckoned with. This is the story of Maji Maji. The scramble for Africa. To understand the Maji Maji Rebellion, we need to rewind to 1884. Picture the scene. 13 European nations and the United States gather in Berlin. Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor of Germany, hosts a conference that will reshape an entire continent. They're not there to discuss Africa's future with Africans. They're there to carve it up like a birthday cake. No African leaders were invited. No African voices were heard. Over the course of 3 months, European diplomats drew lines on maps with rulers, splitting kingdoms, dividing ethnic groups, and claiming territories they'd never even visited. It was bureaucratic violence on a continental scale. Germany was relatively late to the colonial game. While Britain and France had been building their empires for centuries, Germany had only unified as a nation in 1871. Kaiser Wilhelm I and later Kaiser Wilhelm II were desperate to prove Germany's place among the great powers. Colonies weren't just about resources or prestige. They were about national identity, about showing the world that Germany deserved a seat at the imperial table. In 1885, German East Africa was born on paper. It encompassed what is now Tanzania, Burundi, and Rwanda, a territory roughly twice the size of Germany itself. But claiming territory on a map and actually controlling it were two very different things. The German East Africa Company, a private venture backed by the state, was given the task of making this colonial dream a reality. But they quickly discovered that the people already living there had their own ideas about who should rule. The land and its people. German East Africa was not empty land waiting to be civilized, despite what colonial propaganda claimed. It was home to over 120 distinct ethnic groups, each with their own languages, traditions, and systems of governance. The Ngoni, the Yao, the Zaramo, the Pogoro, the Matumbi, the Nyindo. These weren't primitive tribes waiting for European enlightenment. They were sophisticated societies with centuries of history, trade networks that stretched across the Indian Ocean, and political structures that had evolved over generations. In the coastal regions, Swahili culture had flourished for centuries, blending African, Arab, and Persian influences. City-states like Kilwa had once rivaled Venice in wealth and sophistication. The interior was dominated by various kingdoms and chiefdoms, some centralized, others more loosely organized, but all functioning according to their own logic and laws. The economy was diverse and complex. Farmers grew millet, sorghum, and cassava. Herders raised cattle, goats, and sheep. Traders moved ivory, salt, and iron across vast distances. Artisans crafted tools, weapons, and ceremonial objects. This wasn't a subsistence economy frozen in time. It was dynamic, adaptive, and deeply connected to regional and international trade networks. And then the Germans arrived with guns, flags, and an unshakable belief in their own superiority. Early resistance. From the very beginning, the German presence was met with resistance. The coastal peoples, who had dealt with Arab traders and other outsiders for centuries, immediately recognized the German colonial project for what it was: theft on a massive scale. In 1888, just 3 years after Germany claimed the territory, a man named Abushiri ibn Salim led a coalition of coastal leaders in open revolt. Abushiri was a sophisticated operator, part merchant, part warrior, part diplomat. He united diverse groups along the coast against the German East Africa Company, attacking their trading posts, cutting their supply lines, and driving them back to a few fortified positions. The rebellion was so successful that it nearly destroyed the German colonial project before it really began. The German East Africa Company was on the verge of bankruptcy. The Kaiser's prestige was on the line. So Germany did what empires do when their commercial ventures fail. They militarized. The German Imperial Navy was dispatched. Hermann von Wissmann, a veteran explorer and military officer, was given command of a newly formed colonial army. He recruited soldiers from across the empire: Sudanese, Somalis, even Zulu warriors from the south. This was a pattern that would repeat throughout colonial Africa, using African soldiers to conquer other Africans. Wissmann was brutal and efficient. He hanged rebel leaders, burned villages, and established a network of military stations across the territory. By December 1889, Abushiri had been captured and publicly hanged. The coastal rebellion was crushed, but resistance didn't end. It went underground, into the interior, into the hearts and minds of people who refused to accept foreign domination. Over the next 15 years, there were dozens of smaller uprisings, acts of sabotage, and refusals to cooperate. The Germans responded with increasing violence, establishing a reputation for cruelty that would only intensify. The Cotton Scheme. Now we come to the immediate cause of the Maji Maji Rebellion, and it's important to understand this clearly. This wasn't about abstract notions of freedom or independence. This was about survival. In 1902, the German colonial administration introduced a new policy that would change everything. They decided that German East Africa should become profitable. The territory was costing the German government millions of marks every year, and there was increasing pressure back in Berlin to show a return on investment. The solution, they decided, was cotton. The global textile industry was booming. Cotton from the American South had made fortunes for European industrialists. Why not replicate that model in Africa? But there was a problem. African farmers had their own crops, their own agricultural cycles, their own economic priorities. They grew food to eat and to trade. They had no interest in growing cotton for export to Germany. So the colonial administration made it mandatory. Every village in the southern regions was required to set aside communal plots for cotton cultivation. Every adult male was required to work these plots for a certain number of days each year. This wasn't paid labor. It was forced labor, barely distinguishable from slavery. And the work was backbreaking. Cotton is a demanding crop. It requires constant attention, careful cultivation, and intensive labor during harvest season. The colonial overseers, askari soldiers, and appointed headmen, often corrupt and brutal, drove the workers mercilessly. They carried whips made from hippopotamus hide, called kiboko. Anyone who worked too slowly, who missed a day, who failed to meet quotas, was beaten. But the cruelty of the system went even deeper. The cotton plots took up land that would have been used for food crops. The labor requirements took time away from tending family farms. Women and children had to work harder to make up the difference. And for all this extra work, for all this suffering, the compensation was insultingly minimal, often just a few pfennigs, barely enough to buy a bag of salt. Imagine this. You're a farmer. For generations, your family has grown millet and sorghum on this land. You know when to plant, when to harvest, how to read the weather, how to manage your fields to feed your family through the dry season. Your agricultural knowledge is sophisticated, passed down through countless generations, adapted to this specific soil, this specific climate. Then, armed men arrive. They tell you that you must abandon your fields for part of the year to grow a crop you can't eat, using methods they dictate, for payment that won't feed your children. If you refuse, you're beaten. If you resist, you're imprisoned or killed. Your wife and children go hungry. Your ancestors' land is being used to make profits for people you've never met, in a country you've never heard of, for an economy you don't participate in. This was the reality for hundreds of thousands of people across southern German East Africa. And it wasn't just the cotton scheme. There were hut taxes that had to be paid in German currency, forcing people into a cash economy they didn't want or need. There was forced labor on roads and military installations. There was the constant humiliation of being treated as subhuman by colonial officials who saw Africans as little more than beasts of burden. By 1905, the pressure had become unbearable. People were hungry. They were angry. They were desperate. And into this powder keg of rage and suffering came a prophet with a message of hope. The prophet Kinjekitile. His name was Kinjekitile Ngwale, though he would become known simply as Kinjekitile. He was a spirit medium from the Matumbi Hills, a man who claimed to be possessed by the snake spirit Hongo, one of the most powerful deities in the traditional religious pantheon of the region. We don't know a lot about Kinjekitile's early life. The historical record is frustratingly thin, filtered through German colonial reports and oral traditions collected decades later. But we know he emerged as a religious leader sometime around 1904, setting up a shrine near the Rufiji River at a place called Ngarambe. People came to him from across the region, seeking healing, guidance, and relief from the crushing oppression of colonial rule. And Kinjekitile gave them something powerful, a reason to believe they could win. He preached a message that combined traditional African spirituality with a sophisticated political analysis of colonial exploitation. He said the ancestors were angry. The spirits of the land were crying out against the foreigners who had stolen their people's freedom. The Germans were not invincible. They could be defeated. They would be defeated. But Kinjekitile didn't just offer spiritual comfort. He offered a practical solution. Maji, sacred water. He claimed that he could prepare a special medicine, mixed with water, millet, and castor oil, that would make warriors invulnerable to German bullets. If you drank the Maji, if you believed in its power, the bullets would turn to water. The German guns would become useless. The colonizers would fall. Now, from our modern perspective, this might seem like tragic delusion. How could anyone believe that water would stop bullets? But we need to understand this in context. Throughout human history, soldiers have gone into battle believing in divine protection. European knights went to war blessed by priests, believing God would protect the righteous. Japanese kamikaze pilots believed their spirits would be honored in the afterlife. American soldiers have gone to war with Bibles in their pockets and prayers on their lips. Faith in the face of overwhelming force is not unique to the Maji Maji Rebellion. What's unique is how we judge it. And there's something else we need to consider. Kinjekitile's message wasn't just about magical thinking. It was about unity. He preached that all the peoples of the region, Ngoni, Yao, Matumbi, Pagoro, and dozens of others, needed to come together. Ethnic divisions had to be set aside. Old rivalries had to be forgotten. Only through unity could they defeat the Germans. This was revolutionary. These groups had often been enemies. They spoke different languages, had different customs, worshipped different spirits. But Kinjekitile convinced them that they were all part of a larger community, all victims of the same oppression, all capable of the same liberation. Thousands of people made the pilgrimage to his shrine. They drank the Meiji. They received his blessing. They went back to their villages and spread the word. The movement grew exponentially, spreading like wildfire across the southern regions. And then, in July 1905, everything exploded. The first attacks. The rebellion began on July 31st, 1905, in the Matumbi Hills. Warriors armed with spears, arrows, and a few outdated rifles attacked a cotton collection station at Samanga. They killed the overseer and several Askari soldiers. They destroyed the cotton stores. They tore up the fields that had been planted with forced labor. Within days, the uprising spread to neighboring regions. On August 14th, a force of several thousand warriors attacked a much larger target, the administrative center and German mission station at Kilosa. They killed several European missionaries and burned the settlement to the ground. The attacks followed a pattern. The rebels targeted symbols of colonial authority, government buildings, mission stations, cotton warehouses, Arab and Indian traders who collaborated with the Germans. They were strategic, focusing on the infrastructure of colonial exploitation. But the Germans had been caught completely off guard. They had dismissed African discontent as the grumbling of primitives who didn't understand the benefits of civilization. They had convinced themselves that their military superiority was so overwhelming that rebellion was impossible. They were wrong. The rebel forces were larger, better organized, and more motivated than the Germans had thought possible. In the first weeks of the rebellion, they overran dozens of outposts, killed scores of colonial soldiers and officials, and controlled vast swaths of territory. For a brief moment, it seemed like the impossible might actually happen. It seemed like the Germans might be driven out. And then the machine guns arrived. The German response begins. Governor Gustav Adolf von Götzen was in Berlin when the rebellion broke out. He rushed back to East Africa, arriving in early September to find the colony in chaos. The coastal cities were secure, but the interior was in open revolt. Worse, the rebellion was spreading. Groups that hadn't initially joined were now picking up weapons. The unity that Kinjekitile had preached was becoming reality. Von Götzen's response was immediate and uncompromising. He declared martial law across the entire southern region. He called for massive military reinforcements from Germany, and he made it clear that the rebellion would be crushed with maximum force. But he faced a significant problem. The German colonial army in East Africa the Schutztruppe, numbered only about 2,500 men, many of them African askaris. They were spread thin across an enormous territory. The rebel forces outnumbered them by tens of thousands. So von Goetzen asked Berlin for help, and Berlin responded. The German military establishment, smarting from recent defeats and setbacks in other colonial ventures, saw this as an opportunity to demonstrate German power. Reinforcements were dispatched, not just a few hundred soldiers, but thousands. Modern artillery, machine guns, and military supplies were shipped across the Indian Ocean. Command of the military operations was given to a man who would become synonymous with colonial brutality, Major Johannes, and later Captain Wangenheim, among others. But the most significant appointment was that of Colonel, later Governor, Count Gustav Adolf von Goetzen himself, who coordinated the overall strategy. The German strategy was simple: overwhelming force, no mercy, and the complete destruction of any capacity for future resistance. In late August and early September 1905, major battles were fought. At Mahange, thousands of warriors charged German positions. They believed the Maji would protect them. They believed their courage and numbers would prevail. The German machine guns cut them down in waves. At the Battle of Namabengo in September, rebel forces launched a massive assault on a German fortified position. For hours, they charged repeatedly into machine gun fire. Bodies piled up in front of the German trenches. The survivors finally retreated, leaving thousands dead. The Magi hadn't worked. The bullets hadn't turned to water. The Germans hadn't fallen. But the rebellion didn't end. If anything, it intensified. Because even in defeat, even facing overwhelming firepower, the people of German East Africa had decided that death was preferable to continued slavery. They would fight until they couldn't fight anymore, and the Germans would make sure of that. The turning point. By October 1905, the military situation had shifted decisively in Germany's favor. The initial shock of the rebellion had worn off. German reinforcements had arrived. The colonial army now numbered over 5,000 men, including well-trained European soldiers with modern weapons. More importantly, the nature of the rebellion was changing. The early unity that Kinjekitile had forged was beginning to fracture. Different groups had different objectives. Some wanted to drive the Germans out entirely. Others just wanted relief from the cotton scheme. Some were motivated by traditional religious beliefs, while others had more pragmatic political goals. The Germans exploited these divisions ruthlessly. They offered amnesty to groups that surrendered, then broke their promises and executed the leaders. They paid informants and collaborators. They turned ethnic groups against each other, promising one group favorable treatment if they helped suppress another. And they began to implement a new strategy, one that would prove far more devastating than any military victory: the systematic destruction of the economic basis of African society. This brings us to the end of our first hour. We've seen how colonial exploitation created unbearable conditions. We've seen how faith and desperation combined to create a massive uprising. We've seen how that uprising initially succeeded, then began to fail in the face of overwhelming military force. But what comes next is darker still, because the Germans decided that military victory wasn't enough. They wanted to break not just the rebellion, but the very ability of these societies to resist in the future. They wanted to make sure that nothing like the Maji Maji Rebellion could ever happen again. They would do this through hunger, through famine, through the deliberate starvation of hundreds of thousands of people. We'll explore that horror in our second hour. Hour 2. Fire and Faith. The Scorched Earth Policy. Welcome back. In our first hour, we traced the origins of the Maji Maji Rebellion, from the colonial occupation of German East Africa through the cotton scheme that sparked the uprising, to the early battles where African warriors, believing themselves protected by sacred water, charged into German machine guns. Now, we're going to talk about what happened next. And I need to warn you, this hour is going to be difficult. We're going to discuss acts of systematic violence and deliberate starvation that rank among the worst atrocities of the colonial era. By late 1905, the German military command in East Africa had come to a chilling conclusion. Simply defeating the rebels in battle wasn't enough. As long as African communities had food stores, agricultural land, and the ability to sustain themselves, they would have the capacity to resist. Villages could feed warriors. Crops could sustain long campaigns. Even scattered groups of rebels could hold out for years if they could forage and hunt. The solution, the Germans decided, was to remove those resources entirely. In November 1905, a new commanding officer arrived in German East Africa. His name was Gustav von Götzen, and though several officers would implement the policy, the overall strategy of destruction came from the highest levels of colonial administration. The orders were explicit: burn the fields, destroy the food stores, kill the livestock, make it impossible for the population to survive without submitting to German authority. This wasn't a side effect of military operations. This wasn't collateral damage. This was deliberate policy, authorized at the highest levels and implemented systematically across thousands of square miles. German soldiers and their Askari auxiliaries fanned out across the southern regions. They burned villages to the ground. They set fire to fields of millet and sorghum just before harvest time. They destroyed granaries full of stored food. They shot cattle, goats, and chickens. They poisoned wells. They cut down fruit trees. Contemporary German military reports describe these operations with chilling bureaucratic precision. One report notes the destruction of 65 villages in a single district. Another tallies the number of fields burned, wells poisoned, livestock killed. They documented their own genocide. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical destruction. For agricultural societies, food stores represented security, the buffer against bad harvests and hard times. Livestock represented wealth, cultural identity, and social bonds. When the Germans destroyed these things, they weren't just taking away food. They were destroying the foundations of social and economic life. And it worked. Horrifyingly, it worked. Famine as a weapon. Within months, famine began to spread across southern German East Africa. The timing was calculated for maximum impact. The Germans had timed their destruction to coincide with the period after planting, but before harvest. Even if people replanted, they would starve before the new crops matured. The effects were catastrophic and immediate. People began dying by the thousands, then tens of thousands. The elderly and children went first, their bodies unable to survive on roots, tree bark, and whatever else people could scavenge. Then nursing mothers, unable to produce milk. Then previously healthy adults, their bodies consuming themselves. Starvation is a terrible way to die. Your body breaks down muscle tissue for energy. Your immune system collapses. You become vulnerable to every disease, every infection. Your mental faculties deteriorate. You become weak, unable to walk, unable to even cry out for help. And finally, your organs fail, one by one, until your heart simply stops. This was happening to hundreds of thousands of people simultaneously. German military reports from the period, even filtered through the callous lens of colonial racism, document the scale of the catastrophe. They describe abandoned villages full of corpses. They describe people so weak from hunger that they couldn't run away when soldiers approached. They describe children with distended bellies and vacant eyes. One German officer wrote, "The country was completely deserted. Villages were empty and the fields overgrown with weeds. Dead bodies lay everywhere." Another noted that his unit encountered groups of people who were living skeletons, barely able to move. But the Germans didn't stop. They didn't provide relief. They didn't allow humanitarian aid. Instead, they continued the policy of destruction, ensuring that no food sources remained. Some groups tried to flee to areas not yet affected by the famine, but the Germans anticipated this. They established military cordons, preventing movement between regions. They wanted to contain the starvation, to ensure that rebel-held areas were completely isolated and cut off from any possible assistance. It was a policy of deliberate extermination through starvation. Continued resistance. Astonishingly, even in the face of this horror, resistance continued. Not everyone surrendered. Not everyone accepted German domination, even when the alternative was death. Some rebel groups retreated into the most remote and inaccessible areas, dense forests, mountain highlands, swamplands where the German army couldn't easily operate. They conducted guerrilla warfare, hitting supply convoys and isolated outposts, then disappearing back into the wilderness. These fighters were starving just like everyone else. They were watching their families die. They had no realistic hope of military victory, but they fought on anyway, driven by rage, by dignity, by a refusal to submit. Other groups tried different strategies. Some attempted to negotiate, sending emissaries to German officials to plead for terms. But the Germans, sensing total victory, offered nothing but unconditional surrender and punishment for the leaders. There were also desperate attempts to find food. People scavenged in areas the Germans had already burned, hoping to find overlooked grain. They ate roots, leaves, insects, anything that might sustain life. They hunted increasingly small game, birds, rodents, reptiles. They slaughtered what few animals had escaped German destruction, even knowing that eating seed animals would doom future generations. The traditional social structures that had held these societies together began to break down under the pressure. Desperate people did desperate things. There were reports of theft, of violence between starving groups competing for scarce resources, even allegations of cannibalism in the most extreme cases, though these reports should be viewed skeptically given their source in German colonial propaganda. What's remarkable is not that social structures broke down, but that they held together as much as they did. Many communities shared what little food remained, prioritizing children and the elderly. Extended families stayed together even as they weakened. Religious and cultural practices continued, adapting to the desperate circumstances. Human dignity persisted even in the face of systematic dehumanization. Kinjekitile's fate. What happened to Kinjekitile, the prophet whose sacred water had inspired the rebellion? The Germans hunted him with particular intensity. They understood correctly that he was a key unifying figure, a symbol of resistance. Capturing or killing him would deal a devastating blow to rebel morale. In August 1905, just weeks after the rebellion began, German forces tracked Kinjekitile to his shrine at Ngarambe. He was captured along with several of his followers. The Germans didn't bother with a trial or any pretense of justice. On August 4th, 1905, Kinjekitile was hanged publicly. His body was left on display as a warning. But killing Kinjekitile didn't end his influence. If anything, his execution transformed him into a martyr. Stories spread about his final words, his dignity in the face of death, his continued faith that the struggle would ultimately succeed, even if he didn't live to see it. The Meiji tradition continued, even after his death. Other spirit mediums emerged, claiming his mantle, distributing sacred water, and encouraging continued resistance. The faith he had inspired couldn't be killed by hanging one man. This points to something important about the rebellion. While Kinjekitile was crucial in its initial organization and spread, the Maji Maji uprising wasn't dependent on a single leader. It was a genuinely popular movement, rooted in widespread grievances and sustained by the collective determination of hundreds of thousands of people. The Germans would learn that you can kill a prophet, but you can't kill an idea. At least, not with bullets and ropes. But starvation, that was another matter. The camps. As the famine intensified and military resistance crumbled, tens of thousands of people began surrendering to German authorities. They were starving, desperate, and out of options. The Germans established what they called concentration camps. And yes, they used that term, Konzentrationslager, the same term that would later become infamous in the context of Nazi Germany. These weren't death camps in the Holocaust sense, but they were places where huge numbers of people were concentrated under brutal conditions with inadequate food and medical care. The camps were supposedly to pacify the population and prevent future uprisings. In reality, they were holding pens where people continued to die of disease and starvation. Conditions in these camps were appalling. Thousands of people were crowded into small areas with no proper sanitation. Disease spread rapidly: dysentery, typhus, smallpox. Medical care was minimal to non-existent. Food rations were deliberately kept low, both as punishment and to prevent people from regaining the strength to resist. German reports from the camps document death rates that are simply staggering. In some camps, 30 to 40% of inmates died within months. Entire families were wiped out. Children died in their mother's arms. And again, this wasn't accidental. The Germans knew exactly what was happening. They documented it in their reports. They just didn't care. Or more accurately, they saw it as the natural and acceptable consequence of African primitives daring to resist German civilization. The camps also served another purpose: forced labor. Those who survived and regained some strength were put to work on German projects, building roads, working plantations, constructing military installations. The very infrastructure of colonial exploitation was being built by the survivors of colonial genocide. The end of organized resistance. By mid-1906, organized military resistance had effectively ended. The last major rebel strongholds had fallen. Leaders were captured or killed. The population was too weakened by famine to continue fighting. But the Germans didn't declare victory. They continued operations throughout 1906 and into 1907, hunting down scattered groups of holdouts, burning any villages that tried to replant crops without permission, maintaining the military cordons that prevented movement and trade. They wanted total submission. They wanted to break not just military resistance, but the spirit of resistance itself. In August 1906, the German colonial administration conducted a census in the affected regions. The results were shocking even to them. The population of the southern districts had fallen by approximately 1/3. In some areas, The decline was over 50%. Between 250,000 and 300,000 people had died. To put that in perspective, that's roughly equivalent to the entire population of a city the size of Pittsburgh or Cincinnati today. An entire city worth of people dead in less than 2 years. The Germans had won their war, but what they won was a wasteland. International reaction. You might be wondering, didn't anyone notice? Didn't the international community object to this genocide? The short answer is, some people noticed, but almost nobody cared enough to do anything about it. Within Germany itself, there was some criticism. Social Democrats in the Reichstag questioned the costs of the colonial project and raised concerns about military excesses. Catholic missionaries reported on the suffering and appealed for humanitarian relief. A few journalists wrote exposés about the brutal suppression of the rebellion. Internationally, the reaction was muted at best. Britain and France, both with their own colonial empires built on violence and exploitation, weren't about to criticize Germany too harshly. The United States was busy with its own imperial projects in the Philippines and Cuba. Other European powers were either uninterested or actively supportive of German actions. There was no United Nations, no international human rights law, no concept of crimes against humanity or genocide in the modern legal sense. Colonial powers operated with near-total impunity. A few humanitarian organizations tried to provide relief, but they were denied access to the affected areas by German authorities. The Germans didn't want outside observers documenting what had happened. So the world moved on. The Maji Maji Rebellion and its brutal suppression became a footnote, if mentioned at all, in European accounts of colonial history.